Nobody's going to put this on a billboard. No one's going to run a Super Bowl ad that says, "We spent billions of dollars and hired the world's best psychologists specifically to keep you feeling slightly inadequate." Why? Because your inadequacy is profitable. Your insecurity generates revenue. And your confusion about who you are makes it easier to sell to. And then they say that the more lost that you feel, the more that you need us. And if we're being honest, nobody's actually going to say that out loud. But that is exactly what is happening right now to you, to the people you know, to the entire generation that has grown up online. And they've absorbed a set of beliefs about who they are and what they're worth. And they've absorbed all of this before they were even old enough to question any of it. And I think on some level, you already know this. You felt this. That low-level drain, that background noise. It's that version of yourself that you show on the internet, and then the version of who you are when no one's watching. And the way those two things have drifted apart quietly over the years, and you can't point to the place that it started. Today, I'm going to walk you through exactly how that happened. The mechanism, the specific ways, the system that you grew up in, how it was engineered to work against you from the very start. And I'm not going to do this in some sort of conspiratorial way. I'm going to give it to you in a documented research, you can look this up way. Because you cannot fight something you cannot clearly see. And I promise you that by the time this episode is over, you're going to see it very clearly. All right, let's start with something that sounds very abstract, but is actually very physical. The average person alive today encounters more information in a single day than somebody 100 years ago would encounter in a lifetime. One day versus an entire lifetime. Now just let that sink in. Your great-great-grandfather, a full human life, never processed as much raw information as you did yesterday. And here's the thing, our brains were not built for this. Not even close. The human nervous system evolved over hundreds of thousands of years in small tribal communities. These were tight groups, and many anthropologists put these groups to around 150 people, where the information that mattered was immediate, personal, local, and physical. It was very simple things like who's in the group, where's the food, is that sound a threat, and who can I trust? That is the brain that we have. That is the hardware that is running underneath every feed, every notification, every app. And now that very same hardware, that same biological architecture that was built for a tribe of 150 is being asked to process infinite content feeds, global news cycles, a curated highlight reel of thousands of people, trending topics, breaking news, comment sections, DMs, likes, shares, follower counts, all of it, every day, from the very second that you wake up to the second you fall asleep. Look, your brain is not failing. Your brain is doing what any brain does when you drop it into an environment that it was never designed for. The result is a generation that is running on chronic cognitive overload. They're anxious, overwhelmed, stretched thin across 1,000 different inputs, and none of them deep enough to actually satisfy. They're unable to focus, they're unable to be still, they're unable to access the kind of quiet where purpose is found. Because that quiet has been replaced by noise so completely that most people can't even remember what it felt like. And here's the piece that doesn't get talked about enough. That overload has a direct effect on your ability to know who you are. Neuroscientists at MIT found that the prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain that is responsible for long-term thinking, decision-making, self-reflection, and a sense of identity, is systematically weakened by chronic distraction and passive scrolling. The neural pathways that are associated with deep thought and self-knowledge, they literally thin over time when they're not used. What this means practically is that the more that you scroll, the harder it becomes to think clearly about your own life. The capacity for the kind of reflection where deep purpose is found, that capacity gets crowded out. You're not just wasting time, you're eroding the mental infrastructure you need to figure out who you actually are. Distraction culture does three specific things to a person. It shortens attention span, it numbs emotional depth, and it kills the capacity for stillness, which is exactly where real self-knowledge lives. And all three of those things are incredibly profitable for the people who built this system, which brings me to the mechanism. Here's the neuroscience they did not teach you in school. Dopamine. You've probably heard the word. Most people think it's just the pleasure chemical. You know, the thing that fires when something feels good. That's not exactly right. Dopamine's actually the molecule for anticipation. It's what your brain releases in response to the possibility of an award. Not the reward itself, the possibility. It's the exact same chemical pathway that's activated by food, by sex, by drugs, by the moment just before you open a present. It is the engine of motivated behavior. When dopamine fires, you lean in, you seek, you keep going, you pursue. Now, here's what the social media companies figured out. It's a principle called the variable reward schedule. Here's how it works. If you press a button and you always get a reward, you press it predictably. You press it reliably without compulsion. So if you press a button and you don't get a reward, you stop pressing it. But if you press a button and you sometimes get a reward, you will press it compulsively, almost uncontrollably, over and over and over again. The uncertainty itself is what keeps the dopamine loop firing again and again. That not knowing is the product. Why does your Instagram feed refresh every time you pull it down? Why does TikTok give you something that's incredible and then something that's mediocre? Then something that then they give you something that makes you laugh out loud. Then you get something boring, and then you get something that stops you cold. Why? Why does every platform use infinite scroll instead of a fixed amount of content that ends? The unpredictability is not a design flaw. It is the design. The teams of behavioral sciences at these companies, and I want you to understand, like, these are real people with PhDs in psychology and neuroscience whose actual job description was to maximize engagement. They figured out that if the content is always great, you'll watch until it ends and then you'll stop. But if it's variable, where it's sometimes great, sometimes not, you'll keep scrolling indefinitely because your brain is always one pull away from the hit. Look, I want to be straight with you. You are not weak for getting pulled in. You are a human being with a human biology, responding exactly to a system engineered and designed by some of the most sophisticated behavioral manipulation in human history. And you started using it before you were old enough to understand what you were walking into. But here's where it gets worse. Much worse. It's called chronic overstimulation. It's the kind produced by living in these systems every single day for years from childhood. And what it does is it causes your baseline dopamine levels to drop over time. You see, your brain is adaptive. It recalibrates. And what it recalibrates to is the new normal of constant high-intensity stimulation. And when that happens, when your baseline drops, the things that used to start feeling meaningful, they start to feel flat. They start to feel boring. They start to feel like that they require more effort than they seem worth. Things like deep conversation, reading, creative work, silence, nature, prayer, genuine human connection, the things that actually produce a life worth living, they begin to feel like a drag, like a chore, like something you'll get to later when you have more energy, because your brain has been recalibrated to expect a constant high-intensity signal. And real life, real, slow, quiet, meaningful life cannot compete with an infinite scroll. Look, that is not a character flaw. That is what happens to a brain after years inside a system specifically engineered to hijack it. And it sets up something even more damaging. Because once the dopamine system is compromised, once the brain is recalibrated towards shallow, rapid-fire stimulation, what gets crowded out is the exact cognitive capacity that you need to answer the most important questions a human being can ask. Who am I? That's the first layer, the hijack. But the hijack is just the setup. Because what the system does, once it has your compromised attention, is where the real damage happens. And it starts with comparison. Humans have always compared themselves to other people. That is not new. That is deeply evolutionarily wired. For most of human history, social comparison was actually a useful and important function. Knowing where you stood relative to others in your group helped you navigate status, cooperation, and competition. It was used as information and helped you calibrate. But, and this is critical, the comparison was always local, always grounded in full context. For most of human history, you compared yourself to roughly 150 people. It was the people in your immediate community, people whose lives you actually knew. You knew that the guy who seemed to have everything also had a struggling marriage, and he couldn't connect with his kids. And you knew that the woman that everyone admired was held together by threads. You see, you had the whole picture, the behind the scenes and the highlight reel, because you were actually present in each other's lives. Now, think about what's changed. You are now comparing your interior life, your private footage, your anxiety at 2 a.m., your doubt, your bad days, your loneliness, your confusion, shame, depression, against a curated, produced, filtered, optimized highlight reel of thousands of people you have never met. People who are showing you exactly and only exactly what they want you to see. People who are themselves comparing their private footage to your highlight reel and vice versa. You are measuring your worst moments against everybody else's best performances. Research published in the Journal of Social and Clinical Psychology directly linked increased social media use to higher rates of depression, anxiety, loneliness, and a lower self-worth among young adults. Not just correlated, directly linked. But here's the piece that I want you to focus on, because I think it is more damaging in the long run than the depression and anxiety. As serious as those are, comparison changes the question you're asking yourself. When you are constantly measuring yourself against other people's curated images, you stop asking, who am I? And you start asking, who do I need to be to get approval? That shift from identity to performance is where things start to really come apart. Because the moment that you start building your sense of self around what earns approval from an audience, you are no longer living your own life. You are living an audition. And auditions are exhausting, and they never end. And there's no role at the end of it that actually belongs to you. Here's something that I want to add to the comparison conversation that I don't hear talked about enough. Comparison doesn't just make you feel bad, it paralyzes you. There's a difference between those two things. Feeling bad is unpleasant. Paralysis stops your life. When you are constantly watching someone else's lane, their trajectory, their wins, their follower count, their body, their relationship, their apparent sense of direction, you stop running your own. It is physiologically difficult to do both. Your attention is a finite resource, and when a significant portion of it is locked onto other people's lives, there is genuinely less availability for your own. And here's the insidious part about all of it. Comparison doesn't just steal your attention, it distorts your perception of what's even possible for you. When you spend hours every day watching people who appear to be further ahead, your brain starts to use that as a baseline as to what normal looks like. And then suddenly, the gap between where you are and where you think you should be feels not just large, but shameful. It's not just a distance to cover, but evidence that something is fundamentally wrong with you. A 2022 study in the Journal of Experimental Psychology, it introduced a term that I want you to remember. It's called identity foreclosure. It describes what happens when young people lock into identities. Who they are, what they believe, what they value. It's based all on external pressure and social expectation before they've ever had the space to actually develop a genuine sense of self. In other words, they never actually chose who they are. They just absorbed it. They absorbed the aesthetic of whoever was getting the most engagement, the beliefs of whoever had the most conviction online, the values of the culture that was delivering the dopamine. And then they built a life on top of that borrowed identity that they're calling their own. But here's the thing about a borrowed identity. It feels real until it's tested. It feels solid until something shakes it, until a relationship ends, until a career doesn't pan out, until the platform changes its algorithm and the audience disappears, until the thing that you built your worth on stops working. And then underneath all of that, there is nothing there. No foundation, no anchor, because you never actually built on one. You built on someone else's. And what makes this harder to see is that it doesn't feel like performance from the inside. It feels like you. It feels like your opinions, your aesthetic, your values. The borrowed identity has been fully integrated. You've lived inside of it long enough that it has now become invisible, which is exactly why so many people can follow every trending self-improvement framework and still feel completely hollow because they are optimizing a self that they never chose. They are building a better version of the person they never actually decided to be. I want to get specific about something because I think it hits closer to home than most people are actually willing to admit. There are things that you want to do, things that you care about, Dreams that have been sitting in the back of your mind for years. Things that you've thought about pursuing but haven't. Things that you've started but abandoned. Things that you've imagined but you've never let yourself fully imagine because you already knew how it would end, with you measuring it against what someone else is doing and deciding it wasn't enough. You see, comparison gets in before the idea even has a chance to form. You don't just compare results, you compare the right to even try. You see someone doing something that's adjacent to what you want to do, and the immediate reflex is not, that inspires me, but it's, they're already doing better than I ever would. So why would I even try? That reflex is one of the most costly things that comparison does, because it doesn't always show up as fear. It shows up as common sense. It shows up as just be realistic. It sounds like wisdom, but it functions as a cage. And I'll say something directly to the person who has a thing they've been sitting on for months or even years. The fact that someone else is doing something similar is not evidence that there's no room for you. It is evidence that the thing is real and worth doing. The question is not whether the space is occupied. The question is whether the version you have to offer, specific, irreplaceable, shaped by everything you've been through version, exists anywhere else. And let me tell you the answer to that. It doesn't. But you see, comparison will never let you see that clearly, because comparison is not interested in your uniqueness. Comparison is interested in your rank, and you were not created to be ranked. You were created to be deployed. So, we've established two things. One, the system was specifically engineered to hijack your attention and compromise the neural infrastructure you need to know yourself. Two, comparison, supercharged and weaponized by that very system, doesn't just make you feel inadequate, it paralyzes you, forecloses your identity, and gets in the way of the things you were actually made to do. But here's what I haven't told you yet, and this is the part that, when I first understood it, made me genuinely righteously angry. The confusion is not incidental, and the identity crisis is not a side effect. It is the point. Culture, the media, advertising companies, the algorithm does not want you to have a settled, grounded, rooted identity. It never has and it never will. Here's why. People with stable, settled, grounded, rooted identities are harder to manipulate, harder to sell to, harder to control. The culture machine operates best when you feel incomplete, when there's always a gap between who you are and who you want to be, because that gap is where the product goes. That gap is the market. Look, this is not a conspiracy theory. This is the documented operating logic of the attention economy. The entire business model is built on sustained dissatisfaction. Think about advertising for a moment, not the ads themselves, the underlying logic. Every advertisement has one message, and social media is the most sophisticated version, because the gap it exploits is not you need better shoes. The gap it exploits is existential. The gap it exploits is your identity. It's your worth, your meaning. It's the deepest human need, the need to know who you are, why you're here, and that your life matters. And when you monetize that need, will you produce a generation that is exhausted, anxious, unstable, and perpetually available for the next thing that promises to fill that hole? Look, I'm not saying this to be bleak. I'm saying this because the moment you understand that the confusion is not a bug but a feature, something shifts. Because then you stop blaming yourself and you start asking the right question. What would it look like if I opt out? So then the question is, what's the solution? And I'm not talking about some sort of surface level solution, because the problem is not behavioral. It is foundational. And you cannot fix a foundational problem with a behavioral solution. Here's what I mean by that. The reason that the system has so much leverage over you is not just that your phone is addictive. It's that your identity is built on a foundation that this very system controls. When your sense of worth is tied to approval, the algorithm that controls approval controls you. When your sense of success is defined by outcomes the culture assigns value, the culture then controls your ambitions. When your identity is borrowed from whoever was getting the most engagement last month, the platform that distributes that engagement controls who you are. The system has leverage because you gave it something to grab onto. The only actual solution, the only one that addresses the problem at the root, is to build your identity on something that this system cannot reach. Something outside the approval economy. Something that does not shift when the algorithm changes, when the culture redefines a good person, when the audience stops showing up. You need to stand on a foundation that holds, a firm foundation that never shifts and never changes. That is what this podcast is built for. Not for this to be your foundation, but to point you to it, to help you find a firm foundation and to build upon it. And I want to be direct with you. The foundation I'm going to make the case for is not just a philosophy. It's not just a mindset shift. It has evidence behind it. It has intellectual weight, and it's there for you. It has a historical case that I'm going to walk you through in detail because I came to it as a skeptic and I wanted the receipts, and I bet you do too. But before we get there, we have to name the lies because the system doesn't just steal your attention and your identity. It installs specific beliefs, specific lies about your worth, your past, your potential, and your future. Beliefs that are so embedded that they feel like common sense now. And those lies are what we're going to be dismantling next. If any of this has resonated with you whatsoever, I encourage you to check out Born for Battle. The link is in the description, or it's at lionbornstudios.com. All the information on this podcast lives in full detail in that system. But if you're not ready for the full system yet, that's fine. Stay with this podcast. Everything in this podcast is completely free. But if you want everything we've covered here in depth, that ebook is for you. It's for the person who wants the full system in their hands right now. Either way, I encourage you to keep going, to keep running your race, to stay in the fight, and as always, keep the faith.
Push it to the limit, I can't go no more. Red light, no way, I'm coming back home. Long dirt road, all on my own. I'ma be the greatest, write my name in the stone. Write my name in the stone. Yeah, I'm coming back home. Yeah, I'm coming